So we're just recording this real quick because we're looking at, kind of a crazy first 2 weeks of this kind of what we're going to call the heavy tornado season. So we're really ramping up into this because generally when we see the most tornadoes, they start occurring at the beginning of April through May. So considering it was the last week of March and now it's the beginning of April, we're going to have to look and see, what all could happen. And let's look at what happened this past weekend. So there was a huge severe threat, if you weren't aware, across parts of Illinois, Iowa, and other parts of the Midwest. And it was just a massive, they put it all the way up to moderate, and it was just centered at Peoria, Illinois. And when we see this, we generally think, oh yeah, there's definitely going to be a tornado outbreak with this, because you don't see this. So kind of something that was interesting is, are we going to call this kind of a weekend that was a bust, or are we going to call it a weekend that was successful? And the way that we're going to really tell this is by looking at really, was there tornadoes? And there was, but not in the area that we had predicted. And a lot of this, whenever we were looking at the storms on the system of the day of, they all were showing Illinois. There were going to be all these massive tornadoes across parts of Illinois. Well, actually, one of the biggest tornadoes was in Jonesboro, Arkansas. So that's not even anywhere near. It wasn't even on the scale of any. I don't think it was even the slight range. It was just in the marginal, if I have that right. And it was crazy. So really, we're gonna look at here in this episode what was that event? Was it a bust? Was it good? And are these March systems anything like what we could see in April and May? And then also, too, we're going to look at, this is the tornado preseason. And now we're starting to ramp up into it. So what is to be looked almost forward to see, are we going to have a severe year or not? So looking at this year, so far we have had quite a few severe events, mostly across parts of the South, but we have had one or two across parts of the Midwest. So this past week, whenever we saw that there were going to be some thunderstorms, wasn't too surprising. But whenever we saw they were going to be super severe, getting closer to the day of, that kind of surprised everybody. But this was the first outbreak potential of the year. We had a tornado threat. We haven't had an outbreak threat. All the discussions were talking about an outbreak threat. It wasn't ever a tornado threat. It was a potential outbreak that could occur. And that's something that we haven't seen so far. So of course everyone took it seriously and was all prepared and stuff for it. But with that moderate in northern Illinois, that left a whole question of, how far east could these storms travel? And in the aftermath of it, we could see that really in Illinois, we did have some tornadoes, but they weren't really the big stories. We had stories from Evansville, Indiana, Jonesboro, Arkansas, parts of eastern and central Iowa, which eastern Iowa was part of that slight into enhanced, but really what we were focused on is that very border of Illinois, Iowa. But when we're seeing tornadoes in the central part of the state, that's something that was in that more of a slight in the marginal area. So it was kind of a weird system. We would call it a bust because it wasn't what everybody expected. We decided that we should have it, kind of in the system as Illinois because that's where all the energy was going to be at. Well, the problem with that is, there was a dry slot that we can see on the visible radar. You could see there were no clouds, and it was just kind of punched. It was like a little kind of a dent almost in the storm systems. And that's going to, normally a dry slot like that is going to lead to some production of some storms. When you see it in the area that the storm's going to be moving into, that's going to kind of kill the storm. So really looking at all that, that was just kind of a bad thing to see. But there was very large hail. When we look at these storms, they weren't anything to make a joke out of. They just weren't dropping tornadoes. We had tons of tornado warnings across all the Midwest states, but the only problem was there wasn't any tornadoes. That's what kind of lacked the whole accuracy on the outbreak thing, which is great that those didn't happen because it's horrible to see tornado outbreaks. But from a meteorological research standpoint, we didn't see what we had expected. So it's something that's a little bit interesting that we can look back on and see, okay, what were we wrong about and what all happened. But really, it was a very big day storm-wise because we had these huge thunderstorms and they had tons of funnels and stuff reported throughout the whole day, tons of wall clouds, just no tornadoes. So it was really a cool thing to see, just not exactly dropping tornadoes. So there were damaging wind gusts. There was these crazy high winds, 90 mile per hour in some places. Like in Evansville, Indiana, there was a 90 mile per hour wind gust recorded, which could be based on the tornado that had gone through there, but there is some speculation on that. With large hail, we see storms that are more severe, so there's a higher chance of tornadoes with very large hail systems. So combine that with damaging wind gusts, even if there weren't tornadoes, things are being kind of flattened out. We could see some surging ones. Evansville, Indiana was a perfect example of this nocturnal kind of threat that was going on. There was a leading bow echo that was going double or triple the amount of the storm. So it was flying out in front of there. And we saw, like, the example of Jonesboro tornado. It was on the Weather Channel, just popped up out of nowhere and just continued going and just kept going and going and going. So it started building and went right through the middle of town. And that's something we don't want to see, but it's kind of something that was fascinating to watch. And it's crazy that all happened so quickly, but more importantly, we saw tornadoes in Iowa. So that starts to put into question, was our forecast model accurate? Because all of our models had all these huge tornadoes in northern Illinois, so why are they in other states? Well, the energy was just right. We had just enough unstable cape, and we had just enough helicity to allow for some convection to allow these storms while they were building to kind of start spinning. And that's why we had some of these severe storms in areas where we weren't expecting them. Now, we did have severe storms across Illinois, there's no doubt about that, but the daytime heating allowed storms in other areas to really build first. And the convection was rapid in a lot of these areas, so we had storms going 50, 60 mile per hour. So in some cases, that's why we saw in the western Indiana, where that threat was too, where we didn't see tornadoes there, is because, we saw these really fast-moving storms, and through there, with that bow echo, yeah, there's a potential for, a tornado, a quick spin-up, but really there was no time. It was moving too quickly. So, as I mentioned, there was that dry slot, and the temperatures were kind of the same in the area there. They were a little bit warmer in that dry slot. But really the more important thing was there was no clouds. Nothing was being kind of built up out of those clouds. And as that kept extending into the northeast, it was really splitting the system into two energy sources, which we had predicted. We predicted one over Iowa and one heading further to the east. But the problem is when they separate like that, the energy has to go one direction. So that's why it went split weirdly. The energy split too. So it didn't really follow what was expected. But there were many areas in these storms where we saw, 2 and 3 circulations, mostly down in Arkansas and parts of Missouri is where we saw all this rotation. We saw long track supercells, ones that went all the way down from Missouri up into parts of Indiana. And those ones are big, long. We saw a lot of rain and hail with those. But really, the big story about this were tornadoes in other parts of the country. So, not like they're crazy other systems, it's just that they weren't in the area predicted. But looking in the area predicted, we really saw heavy rain, flooding, and just wind damage all the way around. And really, this whole week's storm, this weekend's storm, was big. It was a big system, but the problem is, it was one little thing that could kind of break it apart. So we start to ask the question, is this a bust? Well, here's the problem. It's March, so that's the best it can get for March. From what it looks like severe-wise. We see these very photogenic storms. They're an LP, so low precipitation. And then once they combine, that's when they go into an HP, a high precipitation storm. So we see these events with super high amounts of wind and that type of thing. But we can't really, predict much else. So it's something that we start to look at is, was it too early? And I don't think it was too early. I think it was great that people were out chasing them. But the problem is with that is it's March. We can't expect these super big, powerful setups. We expect those perfect setups to be in the end of April and mostly the whole month of May. Those first 2 weeks of April are kind of building up, and as it gets warmer and warmer. So we don't see these big storms normally, but everything was just set up just right to see some severe storms. So it is it was a kind of a bad March setup. The setup was great, it's just what actually happened. So really overall, it was kind of a trick. So it's something that we have to look at in the future is, improving forecast data and everything. But really overall, if you were in the right area at the right time, especially in Iowa, you got to see 2 and 3 tornadoes out of the same storm at once. And maybe not in the same place, but out of the same storm system. And that was amazing to see on radar. So we ask the question, will this tornado season hold? So will we see it, kind of stay the same as it was last year? Well, we look at kind of some future references on, okay, what's going to happen a month out. And we look and see, and there's a big chance of some severe storms this spring. We'll get into it a little bit later. But we are expecting more tornadoes and more severe storms this year. So that percentage of, I believe 1 in 10,000 storms is a supercell. And then I believe 1 in every 1,000 supercells produces a tornado. Well, with that, we can predict that all of these storms, since there's more of them, that percentage is going to stay the same. But if you take 25% of 4, that's 1. So 1 in every 4. But if you keep going bigger and bigger, you keep going, like, let's say 100, you have 25 out of the 100 storms. So the more storms there are, the more storms that are going to have this tornado threat with them. So it's a direct proportional relationship. And so we see that, and we can predict, since there's going to be more storms this year, more severe storms, so we can already predict that, there will be more tornadoes. So potential target areas, looking at this overall, generally the plains, we could see them, but recently we've kind of been seeing some extension of the plains. We start to see it shift a little bit further to the west, and looking at some future models that could see a month out, we really